Get ready, art lovers and curious minds, for a journey that will shatter the sugar-coated image many hold of one of painting's greatest geniuses. We are about to dive into the murky and, at times, icy waters that flow beneath the luminous surface of Claude Monet's works. Yes, that Monet of flowery gardens, ethereal water lilies, of light dancing on water. Just aesthetic delight. It is also intellectual provocation, a confrontation with the complex and often contradictory human nature, including that of its most revered creators. Be prepared, for what follows is not a gentle pat, but an invitation to reflect. Today, the topic is thorny and direct. The dark side of Claude Monet, what he wouldn't want you to know about him. And don't expect any sugarcoating. As a historian and critic, who has dedicated countless hours to the meticulous study of these giants of canvas and brush, I can confidently assure you, behind every breathtaking stroke of genius, narratives of deep anguish, almost palpable selfishness, and, at times, a coldness in human relationships often lie hidden, which, even if not intentionally cruel, left a trail of pain and misunderstanding. Forget for a moment the almost mythical figure of the friendly old man with a white beard, immortalized in his later years in Giverny, surrounded by flowers and the world's admiration. We are about to undertake an archaeological dig into his biography, beyond the carefully polished public image, and find the man Claude Oscar Monet, of flesh, blood, and many contradictions, with his undeniable artistic virtues, but also with his inner demons and character flaws which, believe me, were neither few nor insignificant. The aim here is by no means to diminish the grandeur of his work, which remains untouchable. On the contrary, it is to humanize him, to understand him in his totality, understanding that genius often flourishes in arid, thorny grounds, and that suffering, inadequacies, and internal contradictions can, paradoxically, serve as fertilizer for overwhelming and transformative creativity. Monet, from his earliest youth, revealed an obstinacy and an iron determination that often bordered on intransigent stubbornness. His father, Adolphe Monet, a merchant with his feet firmly planted in material reality, wished for his son to follow the family business, ensuring a secure and respectable future. However, young Claude, with a conviction that surprised and irritated, had other plans, other dreams, and this visceral refusal to submit to paternal and social expectations would be a constant in his life, a compass guiding him through uncertain but authentically his own paths. His insurgency against the rigid and anachronistic canons of academic painting, his incessant, almost feverish quest to capture the fleeting impression of the moment, the light that transforms every second, the ephemeral reflection that dances on the water's surface. All this revealed a strong, indomitable personality, one that did not easily bow to conventions or authorities. But this same strength of character, this same intransigence that propelled him in art when transposed to the delicate and complex terrain of personal relationships, could manifest in far less admirable ways, sometimes even harmful to those around him. Consider, for example, his tumultuous and intensely passionate relationship with Camille Léonie Dancieux, his first wife, model, and inspiring muse for so many of his most iconic and moving works from his early period. The passion between them was evident, a flame that burned vigorously, but the life he, to a large extent, imposed on her was an ordeal of extreme poverty, of humiliating and constant evictions, of the oppressive shadow of uncertainty about tomorrow. While Monet, the visionary artist, devoted himself with an almost religious fervor to his sacred art, it was often Camille who bore, often in silence and solitude, the crushing burden of domestic difficulties, the hunger that gnawed at their insides, the cold that punished their bones, the incomprehension of a society not yet prepared for the revolution he proposed. He loved her, without a doubt, and his heart-wrenching despair as he painted her on her deathbed in that canvas that is a cry of pain and loss, a requiem in colors and shadows, is palpable, a work overflowing with almost unbearable anguish and a desperate attempt to retain the last image of his beloved. However, the raw truth, stripped of any idealizing romanticism, is that even during Camille's final agony, Monet already maintained an intimate and complex bond with Alice Hoschedé, the wife of his then patron and friend, the collector Alice Hoschedé, a situation, to say the least, ethically slippery, a tangle of loyalties, desires, and needs that defies any simplistic and hasty moral judgment. After Camille's death in September 1879, Monet, along with his 2 young sons, Jean and Michel, began living under the same roof as Alice and her 6 children, in a sort of unorthodox and certainly tense family arrangement in Véteuil, while Ernest Hoschedé, financially ruined and increasingly an absent, ghostly figure, hovered over them. Like a specter from a complicated past, Monet, completely absorbed by his titanic art, by his growing ambitions, and by the daily struggle for survival, delegated to Alice with apparent naturalness and without much questioning the Herculean and thankless task of managing that numerous brood and the household finances, which were a perennial source of worry, conflict, and deprivation. He was, unquestionably, a man of overwhelming passions, but all this intensity seemed, at many crucial moments, to concentrate almost exclusively on his own artistic journey, on his quest for the perfect light, leaving a considerable vacuum, an exiguous and insufficient space for the pressing needs, both material and affective, of those who orbited his incandescent and, at times, inadvertently consuming existence. The care of the children, their education, childhood illnesses, all fell on the shoulders of Camille, and later, Alice, while the genius isolated himself to paint. Poverty and debt were persistent shadows, almost inseparable companions that followed. Monet, like hungry dogs, for long and arduous years of his life, especially in the 1860s and 1870s, he wrote pleading, almost desperate, letters to loyal friends like Émile Zola and Gustave Caillebotte, and to occasional patrons, but above all, to the visionary art dealer Paul Durand-Ruel, who, by the way, was much more than a simple art dealer. He was a true financial and moral pillar, a guardian angel for the impressionist troupe, believing in them when no one else did. In these letters, Monet begged for advances, for any financial help that could alleviate the crushing burden of poverty, describing the lack of firewood for heating, the absence of food on the table, the constant threat from his creditors. He even pawned his most precious possessions, including canvases and personal items, living dangerously on the razor's edge of subsistence. And, let's be brutally honest and realistic, this situation of chronic penury was not solely the result of adverse circumstances in the art market of the time, or the notorious initial incomprehension of the public and established critics regarding his revolutionary painting. Monet, the man, possessed an undeniable appreciation for the pleasures of the good life, a refined taste for wines, food, and a certain comfort even when his pockets were desperately empty and his debts were piling up. When some money by chance fell into his hand, the fruit of a sporadic sale or a friend's generosity, he did not hesitate to spend it, sometimes with a recklessness bordering on irresponsibility, to the silent despair of his family. This financial roller coaster, this endemic instability, generated colossal stress, a palpable and constant tension within his family, hitting the fragile Camille hard first, and later, the resilient Alice. He was perfectly capable of abandoning promising projects or canceling already planned painting trips if the weather or light conditions did not seem absolutely ideal to him, even if such a decision meant further aggravating the financial difficulties faced by his loved ones. His art, his incessant pursuit of the impression's perfection, always came first, second, and third, before any other consideration, and who, in their right artistic mind, would dare to blame him entirely for this monomaniacal dedication when we contemplate the monumental legacy, the transcendent beauty that this obsession has gifted us. However, the human cost of this devotion, the emotional and material scars left along the way, cannot and should not be conveniently swept under Giverny's idyllic, flowery rug. The heroic narrative of Monet as the romantic revolutionary, the misunderstood genius who, alone and against all odds, challenges and eventually overthrows the prevailing and conservative artistic system of the Academy, is a seductive simplification, a convenient myth, but one that lacks important nuances and a more in-depth analysis. He was, without a shadow of a doubt, a radical innovator, a true watershed in the history of Western painting, but he was also a man profoundly aware of his professional trajectory and the intrinsic and also commercial value of his artistic production. He knew, and how he knew, how to negotiate the terms of his contracts with dealers, understood the growing importance of promoting himself, of building his public image, and when fame and financial recognition finally knocked on his door, after decades of struggle, he knew how to manage his career and his assets with remarkable, almost businesslike astuteness, something uncommon for artists of his time. Make no mistake about the image of the ethereal dreamer. He was no naive soul, lost in bucolic reveries amidst his idyllic landscapes and carefully planned gardens. He was, above all, a focused professional, determined to achieve the critical recognition and financial stability that had been denied him for so long, and that he so craved. And in this arduous and highly competitive journey, he could be incredibly demanding, impatient to the core, and on certain occasions frankly unmanageable, and even rude to those who, in his view, did not meet his high expectations or hindered his plans. Whether they were influential dealers like Georges Petit, with whom he had a more commercial and less paternalistic relationship than with Durand-Ruel, renowned art critics, fellow artists, or even close friends and longtime collaborators. His vast and revealing correspondence, a documentary treasure for art historians, unveils a man at times irritable, prone to complaints and grievances, and endowed with a self-confidence that, in certain contexts and for certain interlocutors, could easily be mistaken for unbridled arrogance or exacerbated egocentrism. But this same unwavering faith in himself, this profound conviction in his own talent and artistic vision, was, most likely, the essential fuel that propelled him forward to persevere, despite fierce and often unfair criticism, painful rejections at the salons, and the numerous personal and professional setbacks life imposed on him. It is perhaps the most delicate and controversial of all, and which Claude Monet himself, with all certainty, would have preferred to keep veiled, hidden, concealed beneath the dense and fragrant morning mists of his beloved and iconic water garden in Giverny. His notoriously explosive, volatile, and unpredictable temperament, detailed and consistent accounts from contemporaries, including close friends like Georges Clemenceau, family members like his stepdaughter and later daughter-in-law Blanche Hoschedé Monet, and meticulous biographers like Gustave Geffroy paint a portrait of a man of cyclothymic moods, capable of truly Homeric fits of rage, of extreme irritability, when his artistic designs were thwarted, or worse still, when his sacred and methodical painting routine was minimally disturbed by any unforeseen event or external interference. In Giverny, the rural retreat where he finally found the long-sought financial stability, international recognition, and peace of mind to dedicate himself fully to his art. In his last 30 years of life, he metamorphosed into a kind of absolute monarch, an undisputed sovereign in his own enchanted and flowery kingdom. Everything, absolutely everything in that microcosm revolved around his work, his imperious and obsessive need to paint. The mealtimes of the large family, the leisure activities of the children and stepchildren, visits from friends, admirers, and potential buyers, everything was rigorously subordinated to his incessant search for the perfect light, the fleeting, atmospheric effect, the exact brushstroke, that would translate his instantaneous perception of nature. His stepchildren and children, silent and often intimidated witnesses of this regime of total artistic dedication, learned from an early age the subtle art of tiptoeing, speaking in whispers, avoiding any noise or sudden movement that might risk awakening the proverbial wrath of the master in his creative process. This monastic, almost priestly dedication to art is, on one hand, profoundly admirable and inspiring. But imagine just for a moment the constant pressure, the atmosphere of tension, the daily and silent renunciation that this environment imposed on those who shared his daily life, on those who lived in the imposing and demanding shadow of the giant. It is at this very point in our investigation that an almost unbearable tension emerges, a paradox that defines the trajectory of many creative geniuses. The sublime artist, capable of creating transcendent beauty, was also a man with deep human flaws, sometimes glaring and difficult to reconcile with the delicacy of his work. His unhealthy obsession with pictorial perfection, his relentless self-demand, led him with alarming frequency, and to the despair of his dealers, to destroy his own canvases in a ritual of fury and frustration, slashing them with knives or burning them whenever he felt that the final result had not reached the intangible ideal, the exact impression he pursued in his mind and on his retina. How many potential masterpieces, how many glimpses of his unique genius were irretrievably lost to posterity in these moments of artistic self-flagellation, of chronic dissatisfaction. To us, mere spectators of history, this may sound like a tragic whim, an incomprehensible waste of talent and effort. But for him, for Monet, it was a constant, internal battle, a private and painful war waged with paints, brushes, and mutable nature. And this incessant struggle, this perennial dissatisfaction that consumed him from within, was, in fact, an intrinsic and inseparable part of his complex creative process. He never settled for the easy, the superficially pleasant, the merely beautiful or decorative. He sought something deeper, an essential and ephemeral truth contained in light and color, an essence that slipped through his fingers like water, like time. And this frantic, almost desperate quest, my dear friends of art, comes at a very high price, a considerable emotional and psychological cost, a price that often is paid not only by the visionary artist in his creative solitude, but also, and perhaps even more painfully and silently, by those who share his life, his anxieties, his glories, and his daily torments. His long and complex relationship with Alice Hoschedé, whom he finally married in 1892, after Ernest Hoschedé's death, was apparently solid and lasting, based on deep complicity and mutual admiration, but it was also invariably permeated by the eccentricities, obsessive manias, and iron demands of the master of Giverny, which certainly did not make her life a constant bed of roses, demanding from her admirable patience and adaptability. Our complex and fascinating Monet, it is imperative to state categorically that he was not a soulless monster or a comic opera villain. Far, far from it. He was, essentially, a man of his troubled and transitional time, the 19th century, with all its complexities, virtues, and contradictions inherent to the fragile and imperfect human condition, potentiated, in his specific case, by an extraordinary, almost superhuman artistic talent, and by an exacerbated sensitivity, a soul on edge, which made him particularly vulnerable to the tempests of life and art. The thorny and delicate issue of fatherhood also reveals itself to be swampy and difficult terrain to navigate in Claude Monet's intricate biography. With Jean, his firstborn, with the suffering Camille, born in 1867, and with Michel, the couple's second son, born in 1878, shortly before his mother's death, the paternal relationship seems to have been marked by considerable distance, by a certain affective neglect, especially during the long and bitter years of incessant struggle against extreme poverty, artistic obscurity, and belated recognition. Monet was so deeply immersed, almost drowned, in his titanic battle for material survival, and the affirmation of his revolutionary artistic vision that almost inevitably family life, daily domestic demands, and the pressing affective needs of his young children ended up relegated to a second, perhaps third, plane in his existential priorities. It was the strong and pragmatic figure of Alice Hoschedé who, with her inexhaustible energy, administrative capacity, and maternal dedication, ended up assuming a central and fundamental role, not only in the upbringing and education of her own 6 children from her marriage to Ernest, but also in that of Monet's 2 motherless boys, filling as much as possible an effective and practical vacuum left by the father absorbed in his art and his own demons. And even when the financial tide finally turned in his favor from the 1890s onwards, bringing prosperity, material security, and international recognition, Monet's absolute priority, the center of his universe, continued to be his meticulously cared-for garden transformed into a living work of art in Giverny, and his endless canvases, his incessant pursuit of light. Is there a certain intrinsic selfishness, an almost pathological need for isolation and self-absorption inherent to the creative genius, a vital urgency to protect oneself from worldly demands, from the trivialities of everyday life, from external interruptions, in order to be able to give full and unrestricted vent to one's overwhelming creative force? It is an uncomfortable, provocative question, and the answer most likely leans towards a cautious and nuanced yes. And this characteristic, it is worth stressing to avoid hasty generalizations, is not exclusive to Monet. It is a behavioral pattern, a psychological dynamic that repeats itself with variations in intensity and manifestation in the biographies of countless other great artists throughout history, a heavy burden, perhaps a necessary evil for the creation of works that transcend time. Another aspect of Monet's life and career that he would most likely prefer not to be so meticulously explored, analyzed, and publicly debated is his complex, the multifaceted, and at times tense and competitive relationship with other artists in his inner circle and on the Parisian art scene of the time. Although he was undeniably a central figure, one of the pillars, and a fundamental catalyst in the emergence and consolidation of the Impressionist movement, actively participating in several of its seminal and revolutionary exhibitions between 1874 and 1886. He was also a fiercely independent individual, jealous of his creative autonomy, and on certain occasions, openly competitive and even somewhat disdainful toward some of his peers. His friendships with prominent figures like Camille Pissarro, Auguste Renoir, Alfred Sisley, and Edgar Degas were genuine and important in many respects, forged in the camaraderie of the common struggle against oppressive academicism and the incomprehension of official criticism, but they were also frequently punctuated by latent or manifest artistic rivalries, by profound aesthetic disagreements, by ego clashes, and, why not say it, by a considerable dose of mutual envy and distrust. Monet possessed a crystal-clear, personal, and uncompromising vision of his own artistic path, and did not hesitate for a moment to distance himself from the group, to pursue a solo career, to seek his own channels for exhibition and sale when he felt that his personal objectives and artistic ambitions no longer aligned with the collective ideals or strategies of the group. His strategic decision from the mid-1880s to exhibit individually with powerful dealers like Georges Petit, actively seeking the recognition and consecration of the official Paris Salon, the very same salon he had so criticized and fought in. His rebellious and iconoclastic youth, and of the burgeoning bourgeois art market, was interpreted by some of his former Impressionist comrades-in-arms, like Pissarro, as a kind of betrayal, an abandonment of the original, cooperative and challenging principles of the movement. But for Monet, this was a matter of pure pragmatism, of professional survival, and above all, of a forceful affirmation of his singularity his individual value as an artist, and his ambition to reach the top. He knew exactly what he wanted for his career, and spared no effort or words to achieve his goals, even if it meant hurting susceptibilities or breaking bonds of friendship. His relationship with Cézanne, for example, was one of mutual admiration, but also of a certain distance, while with Degas, barbs and acerbic criticisms were frequent, despite underlying respect. And what can we say about his relationship with the outside world, beyond the gates and high walls of his private and self-sufficient paradise in Giverny, especially during his last and prodigiously productive years of life, when international fame was more than consolidated, and his figure was almost legendary, a living monument of modern art? Monet gradually and consciously transformed himself into a kind of reclusive hermit, in his own flowery and aquatic Eden, a lay monk dedicated to the obsessive cult of light, color, and visual sensations. The grim and terrible news of the First World War, 1914-1918, reached him through newspapers and letters from friends like Clemenceau. France was bleeding and suffering the indescribable horrors of the conflict in its trenches. His own son, Michel, and his stepsons were fighting on the front lines, but he remained, apparently unshakably, immersed in his water lilies, his Japanese pond, his weeping willows, obsessively seeking to capture the infinite and subtle variations of light, color, reflection, and atmosphere on his monumental canvases, the famous Grande Décoration. Some critics and historians, at the time and later, might interpret this stance as a form of deliberate alienation, an almost apathetic and selfish detachment from the tragic and convulsed reality that plagued the world and his own homeland. Others, however, and perhaps with more insight, might see in this total and absolute artistic immersion a form of silent and profound resistance, a way of affirming transcendent beauty, spiritual strength, and the permanence of art even amidst chaos, barbarism, and widespread destruction that threatened civilization. His monumental series of water lilies, generously donated by him to the French state at Clemenceau's insistence as a grand and pacifying monument to peace and national reconciliation, shortly after the armistice was signed in 1918, seems to corroborate and lend strength to this second, more noble, engaged, and humanist interpretation. But still, and despite this magnanimous gesture, the image persists of a man who meticulously and obsessively built his own private universe, and who, as the years passed, increasingly took refuge and isolated himself in it, perhaps as a form of instinctive self-protection against the pains, anxieties, and ugliness of the outside world, or perhaps more profoundly due to an intrinsic and visceral need of his artist's soul, an incessant search for an aesthetic absolute, for a mystical communion with nature that transcended the contingencies of history. The delicate and dramatic issue of his vision, severely affected by progressive bilateral cataracts in his last 20 years of life, adds another layer of drama, physical and psychological suffering, and complexity to his already intricate and fascinating biography. The insidious disease which threatened to rob him of the most precious and indispensable instrument of his craft, his sharp, trained, and hypersensitive eyes to light and color, plunged him into long and excruciating periods of deep anguish, despair, frustration, and paralyzing depression. The colors he perceived were irremediably altered, distorted. Blues and greens became confused, yellows and reds intensified. Almost hallucinatorily, the visual world became progressively cloudy, blurred, a constant milky haze that prevented him from distinguishing the subtle nuances that were the very essence of his art. Some art historians and experts on his work, like Patrick Trevor Roper, speculate with good ophthalmological and stylistic grounds that the darker, almost somber, sometimes muddy tones, and the increasingly abstract, gestural, and deconstructed forms of his last powerful works, especially those painted between 1918 and 1922, before the surgery are a direct and poignant reflection of this debilitating visual condition and his Herculean attempt to continue painting despite it. He bravely resisted for years on end, submitting to the risky cataract surgery, fearing the real risk of losing his sight completely, which for him would be an artistic and existential death sentence. When he finally relented in 1923, operating on one eye, the recovery was a slow, painful process, fraught with complications and uncertainties, including xanthopsia, yellowed vision, and subsequent correction with special glasses. Imagine, if you can, for a moment, the indescribable torment of a painter who dedicated every fiber of his being, every minute of his existence, to capturing the ephemeral light and vibrant color of nature, and who suddenly finds himself deprived of the crystalline clarity of his perception, trapped in a world of shadows, distortions, and visual uncertainties. This titanic struggle against impending darkness, this obstinate, almost superhuman persistence in continuing to paint, even with severely compromised vision, using color memory and the force of habit, reveals once again his extraordinary and unwavering willpower, his resilience, and his almost fanatical, religious devotion to his art, which was, for him, more vital than the very air he breathed. Here, at this point in our exploration, we reach a moment of suspense, of expectation, a pause for reflection before any attempt at a final verdict, if such a thing exists or is desirable in the analysis of such a monumental and multifaceted figure. After all this raw exposure, this sometimes merciless but necessary dissection, what effectively remains of the imposing figure of Claude Monet, an unquestionable artistic genius but marred by his all-too-human flaws, an ordinary man in his personal virtues and vices, but graced with an uncommon, almost divine, artistic talent that redeems him from his imperfection. The truth, as almost always happens when we deal with the complexity of human experience, is much richer, more nuanced and paradoxical, and lies somewhere elusive between these simplifying extremes. Claude Monet was, in his deepest essence, the very personification of human contradiction, raised to the nth power. He was capable of atrocious selfishness in his personal relationships, and at the same time, of surprising generosity towards friends in need. He could be rude, intractable, and choleric in his daily life, but also demonstrated extreme sensitivity to beauty and an almost feminine delicacy in his brushstrokes. He was a calculating pragmatist in his business dealings and, simultaneously, an incurable dreamer, a poet of light and water. And it is precisely this rich, disconcerting, and sometimes irritating complexity that makes him such an eternally fascinating figure, so real, so painfully human, and for that very reason, so modern and relevant to us today. His supposed sins, his undeniable behavioral and ethical shadows, do not in any way diminish the stunning beauty, the transcendent power, and the revolutionary impact of his immortal canvases. On the contrary, these lesser-known and less flattering facets remind us forcefully and liberatingly that the most sublime art, the art that truly touches the soul and transforms our perception of the world, can, and often does, spring from the most troubled, dark, and imperfect depths of the human spirit, that the serene, ethereal, and almost mystical water lilies we so admire in his most famous paintings floated in the concrete reality of Giverny on waters that were not always limpid, tranquil, or pure, but that also reflected the inner storms of their creator. Knowing Monet, the man, with all his glaring imperfections and discreet virtues, with his miseries and his grandeurs, allows us to appreciate his vast and luminous work with a more mature, more critical, more informed, and paradoxically more compassionate, more indulgent, and more profoundly human gaze. We do not need immaculate saints or unblemished heroes to create lasting and significant beauty. We need, yes, complex, fallible, contradictory human beings with all their baggage of light and shadow, of glory and misery, of creation and destruction. Therefore, dear art appreciators, the next time your eyes meet a vibrant Monet landscape, be it the sun-drenched fields of red poppies in Argenteuil, the mutable and ghostly facade of Rouen Cathedral, bathed in a myriad of different atmospheric lights, or the abstract and meditative reflections of his water garden in Giverny, allow yourselves for a moment to remember the complex, contradictory, and intensely human man behind the magic brush and the dazzling color palette. Remember his incessant struggles for survival and recognition, his personal sacrifices, and, crucially, the often invisible and unrecognized sacrifices that he, by action or omission, imposed on those who loved him and accompanied him on his journey, his overwhelming passions that consumed him entirely, his existential and artistic anxieties that haunted him until the end of his life. Remember that divine light, that palpable atmosphere he so masterfully knew how to capture and eternalize on his canvases, was perhaps, ultimately, a desperate, urgent, and cathartic way of exorcising his own inner darkness, his particular demons, his chronic dissatisfactions, and by making this deep and honest connection between the man and the work, between biography and art, you will by no means be desecrating his sacred memory or diminishing his immeasurable artistic legacy. On the contrary, you will be exponentially enriching your own aesthetic experience, making it more complete, more significant, more true. Because great art, my friends at Creative Pulse, is not just about what we see on the surface of the canvas, about formal beauty or technical skill. It is fundamentally about what it makes us feel, think, question, and discover about ourselves and the world, about the intimate, transformative, and sometimes disturbing connections we establish with the artist, with his time, with his world view, and with the eternal, universal, and disconcerting human condition that he so potently represents and expresses. Monet, with all his overwhelming genius and his so profoundly human flaws, continues even today, more than a century later, to challenge us, to enchant us, to disturb us, and to teach us about the complex, multifaceted, and often painful, but always fascinating beauty of artistic creation and of imperfect life itself.